To another Swift tutorial. Today we're going to be taking a look at how we can use the Model View ViewModel, otherwise known as MVVM, design pattern in our iOS app. So first and foremost, hit that like button below if you're excited for MVVM, and if you are into iOS development in general. I do Swift tutorials daily. With that being said, let's get into it. So MVVM, like I mentioned, is a design pattern in iOS to split up parts of your code. So the model is your data part, a view is what the user sees, the actual user interface, and the view model is the part of the data that is actually shown on the view, hence the term view model. So if you're not familiar with Model View Controller, I encourage you to take a look at a video I have on that, because this concept of MVVM improves MVC. And I'll also mention that MVVM is super popular in industry. Apps from Google, Facebook, Microsoft, even Apple actually use this design paradigm for the sake of it being cleaner than MVC. So a problem that MVC often has is the controllers get really large, and people often joke and call them massive view controllers. So MVVM further adds this view model thing, which we're going to show in an example, that helps clean up what the controller has to do. Now, in this diagram that we see here, we see a bunch of arrows going from the view to the view model to the model. And this is similar to MVC in the way that when a model changes, it tells the view model, which will then go and update the view. And something that people often confuse with this design pattern is you don't see a controller here. And that isn't because we're not going to have a controller. That's just because the MVVM pattern already assumes that we have a controller and focuses the actual pattern on the view model and the model being two distinct objects. So with that being said, let's actually close up our browser here, and we're going to hop into Xcode, and we're going to show an example of MVVM with implementing a custom table view. If you're not familiar how to implement custom table view cells, I encourage you to watch a video I have on that, which goes through the basics of that. So that being said, let's start with a single view application. Let's call it whatever you want. I will call it MVVM. Save it wherever you want. Make sure you have your simulator up, of course. So first and foremost, we're gonna just set up a basic table view, and then once we have that up and running in our app, which we're gonna really quickly compile this for, we're gonna add a custom cell and talk about the view model piece, because that's really what's new in this pattern, right? So let's go to our view controller. In our view controller, we're gonna add an outlet and implement a basic table view. So bear with me while I go through that boilerplate for you all. So we have a UI table view outlet. In here, we're gonna say table view, delegate, data source, and let's just add them up here. Actually, we're gonna do UI table view, data source, delegate, and we're gonna do number of rows. We're gonna say data.count, and of course data, we don't have anything right now. Let's do data equals some strings, or an array of strings rather. And we're gonna do cell for row. We're gonna say let cell equals table view, and we're gonna dequeue a cell for an identifier of cell and index path. And we're gonna set the cell's label. Whoops. Cool, and then we're gonna return the cell. And lastly, we're gonna do did select cell. Whoops, we're gonna do did select, I believe it's this one. Let's see, table view did select row. That's what I wanted. And in here, we're gonna do table view deselect at the index path and animated true. And before we run this, we're gonna go and in our storyboard, we're gonna add the table view and a cell and the cell ID. So let's come in here Let's hit this, find a table view in our list of stuff, drag it on. Let's add that constraint, or sorry, let's add that outlet connection before we add the constraint, like so. Then once we click it, we're going to add a couple constraints to this guy by hitting this. We're going to pin it to each side. And let's see, what else do we need to do? We need to add a cell and give it the identifier that we put in our code. So for prototype cells, we're going to increment this number by 1. Let's expand this to give ourselves some more room to work. 1. And let's come in here, go to the table view cell, and give this an ID of cell. So let's run it. And again, I know I went through that pretty fast, but if you're not familiar with table views, I have a separate video on it. Cool, so we have basically this controller and a table view with these 3 cells. So we have the controller part down, we have the view part down as these cells, and we have arguably models, which in this case are these strings. So we're gonna actually expand this and add a real model object, which will be a struct, and we're gonna make it a person. So let's come down here and make a struct and call it person. And let's add some properties in here. So let's do that first name, which is a string, last name, gender, age, nationality. No, let's actually do something that's a different type. Let's do something let's do height. We'll call that a double. So this is a pretty basic struct person model. And up here, what we're going to do is our data is going to contain 3 of these person objects. And we're going to say Dan, Smith, male, 25, and I don't know, 144. However tall that would be in inches. Let's copy and paste this 2 more times. And let's change the name to Betty and John, and it could all be Smith. In our actual cell text label assignment, because this is a person, let's make it this dot first name. And let's run our app once more. So now we have a proper model that we've introduced. We have a view in our cell and we have a controller. So this is MVC and we see our names here. So how do we do the view model piece? The way we do that is by creating another object, and we can call it, in this case, we can call it cell view model. And if you take a look here, we have a person that we're creating, and from that person on the cell, we're only assigning the first name. So the only part of the model that, in this case, the cell needs is the first name. For the sake of this example, what we want to actually do is we want to show each cell with the first name space the last name. So our view model actually only needs 2 properties from the model. So you can also think of a view model as a subset of some of the data in the model. So what we're going to do in here is we're going to create 2 properties, and we'll be lazy and copy and paste them actually. And what we want to do in here, in the cell for row function, instead of doing this, assigning it directly, we're going to create an instance of a view model. And this is going to be cell view model. And we're going to initialize it with a first name and a last name, which we're going to get from the model. So let's copy this and say model. And of course, we're going to delete this. So we're going to say the first name is the model.first name. The last name is model.last name. And in the assignment of the actual cell, what we can do is we can say this cell's label equals this string, which is going to be view models first name space view models last name. So if you look at this, what we were doing before is pretty similar, but we've now introduced this intermediate thing, which basically strips out of our model the stuff we don't need for the purposes of the view. And let's run this one more time. And you'll see that our cell has our first name and last name, but it's getting the data directly from the view model. The value that this brings to our apps and complex views and model situations is if the underlying model changes and we want to tell the view model, hey, something changed, update your view, we can avoid doing that process if something changes that's not in the view model that the user isn't seeing. In other words, if let's say the height changed for whatever reason, let's say this is the Facebook app and the person went in and they updated their height value. We're not even showing the height. So there's absolutely no reason that we need to tell the view model that that user's height has changed, update the cell, because the cell doesn't even have it. So right now we have the controller with the view model in here, and we also have the model object in here. Now, obviously we can put this in a separate file, but the thing that's also in here, which we're going to abstract right now, is the cell. And this is similar to how we do custom cells that I've done in a previous video. But to show how this separates stuff out, we're going to come up here and add a new file. And it's going to be a Cocoa Touch class. And we're going to call it, let's do UI table view cell actually first and foremost. And we are going to call it custom table view cell. Check this box to add a XIB, keep it as Swift, enter, enter. In this cell, what we want to do is add two functions and a label. So we're going to add an outlet, we're going to do label. Yeah, let's do my label actually. And the two functions we're going to add, one is to return the nib itself, which is an instance of this cell, and the other is going to be a configure function. So we're going to have a static function called nib, which is going to return a UI nib. And this nib stuff is not relevant to this video, but it is relevant to dividing up our pieces in the app. So if you're not familiar with this, take a look at another video I have on custom cells. So we're going to return this nib, and then we're going to have the meat of this cell, which is going to be the configure function. So we're going to say configure with view model, and it's going to take in a cell view model, and we're going to say my labels text equals the view model's first name and the view model's last name. And let's also put a property on here for the cell identifier. So we're going to say static let cell identifier equals a string. Let's head to our nib for this cell, or XIB. Still to this day, 10 years later, I don't know why people call it nibs, even though it's spelled with an X. But let's add a label on here. And let's add some constraints, pinning it to all sides. We're going to do 10, 10, 10, 10. Let's connect our outlet from the actual cell, the my label, to our label. And lastly, in here, let's click this and add the identifier, which we've copied and pasted as a file name. Let's head back to our our view controller. Let's register this cell on the table view. So we can say table view register nib for cell reuse identifier. So the reason we added those convenience functions, we can do this cell dot nib and the cell dot cell identifier. And in the cell for row, what we can do is we can say for this we want this dot cell identifier, and we want to say as this cell. And instead of supplying this text label text stuff directly, what we can do is we can say cell.configure, pass in our view model, And we can actually shorthand this even more by getting rid of this. Well, let's actually keep that. But what we can do is let's take this whole initialization of our view model and toss it in here. Get rid of this. And now we've pulled out our view and it's living inside of this this custom table view cell object. So let's run this and see what we get. It should look like pretty much the same, assuming we didn't forget to do something, which we didn't. So we have our label in this cell. It's this custom cell that we have here, which is a subclass. We have a label in here, which is my label. We added this public setter function, which takes in our view model and sets the label on this, sets the text on this label. We added this nib function to get our nib to assign it to the table view easily. And that about does it. That's MVVM in a nutshell for you. And as you start to build apps with more complex views that take in more data to show and update, you'll understand why view models can be super, super useful because models can get very, very large. Like if you think of a model for a person's profile on Facebook, there are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of fields on it, whereas a profile might only show 5 things because your device is so small. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. Hit that like button if you found this useful, if you like the info. Comment if you have any questions, concerns, feedback. I always love hearing from you guys. I do Swift tutorials daily, plus other tech stuff along the way that comes to mind. Subscribe if you're new, and yeah, I will catch you in the next video.